SubhanAllah, this is a good reminder first for myself and to all of you that to pay our zakat, as one of the sunnahs of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his Sahaba is to pay their zakat in the month of Ramadan, and of course to generously support this masjid. The majority of the revenue and the budget comes from donations in the month of Ramadan. So brothers and sisters in Islam, inshallah, today we'll talk about the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So one of the things the Imam's office has been encouraging us in this month of Ramadan is to reflect on the various signs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about in the Quran. And today we'll be speaking about birds, because birds is a theme that you find in the Quran in the various verses. And we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala points to the birds as an example of His mercy, His rahmah to humanity. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the birds in many verses in the Quran. It's remarkable. I was searching and researching, and there are almost 10-15 times Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the word tayr, and in different contexts. And we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in 3 different verses talks about birds as a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for example, in Surah Al-Nahl, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Alam yaraw ila tayr musakharat fi jawas sama ma yumsikuhunna illa Allah. Allahu Akbar. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, speaking, awalam yaraw, don't you see? And this is something, a verb you see a lot in the Quran, ara, yara, that don't you actually see with your eyes, a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To the bird that's floating in the air. Only the thing that's making that bird float and stay up there is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Subhanallah. Inna fi dhalika la ayatin liqawmi yu'minun. Subhanallah. And this is verily a sign for those people who believe, that have iman, that they see this bird that's heavy. If you actually hold the bird in your hand, it would be heavy. And subhanallah, now during our times we have planes. There are tons. If you actually weighed some of these planes, there are multi-ton planes. But how are they just gliding in the air like that? Subhanallah. And we see this. We live close to Dulles Airport, and we're seeing always planes in the sky, landing, taking off. This is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying a sign for the believers, a sign for people who have iman in their heart. Another example is in Surah Al-Mulk. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, don't you see the bird? فَوْقَهُنَّ صَافَّاتٍ وَيَقْبِدٍ. Subhanallah. That this bird is floating in the air, and they have these wings, and they open them and they close them. Open them and close them. And even today, subhanallah, when the engineers, when they were planning on making the plane, the Wright brothers, and I went, subhanallah, I visited the Wright brother memorial, they said that they were trying to be like birds. That's what their goal. And if you look at the initial planes, they weren't, you didn't sit up like this and steer it. They actually lie down like a bird. And they put their hands on the wings, and then they will float like a glider in the air. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying here, don't you see these birds in the air? That they're moving their hands and their wings. مَا يُمْسِكُهُنَّ إِلَّا الرَّحْمَنُ. Allahu Akbar. That the only way that they're floating and flying like that is because of the most merciful. إِنَّهُ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ بَصِيرٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the ability to see everything. So the first verse, we see the idea of focusing on iman, that if we're believers, we would see this, and we would believe. And the second, focusing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees everything. And then in other verses in the Quran, we see that the birds play an important role with the prophets. So Ibrahim alayhi salam, he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, كَيْفَ تُحْيِي الْمَوْتَى? How is it possible that something's dead, it raises back to life? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَوَلَمْ تُؤْمِنْ? Don't you believe? Don't you have iman in your heart? And then he says, وَلَكِنْ لِيَطْمَئِنَّ قَلْبِي. Subhanallah. I want to have tranquility in my heart. So what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell him to do? He says, take فَخُذْ أَرْبَعَ مِنَ الطَّيْرِ. Take 4 birds and cut them up and put them in different mountains. And then call them, and they will come back to you. Subhanallah. So once again, we see the importance of birds as a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That these birds, they will fly back to you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have said, why don't you just take 4 different animals or camels? But the idea of these birds flying back to you is a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we see this also with Isa alayhi salam. Isa alayhi salam had many different signs and miracles, bi'idhnillah. And one of the signs that Isa alayhi salam had is that he took a bird, he shaped a bird, and some of the ulama and the mufassirin, they say he made it out of clay. كَهَيَّةِ الطَّيْرِ بِإِذْنِهِ فَتَنْفُخُ فِيهَا فَتَكُونُ طَيْرًا. SubhanAllah. So he took a bird, he shaped it out of clay, and then he blew it, and then it became a bird, and flew up in the sky. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, this is bi'idhnillah. This wasn't because he was divine in himself, but rather he was someone that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed, and he gave him miracles. And we see this, subhanAllah, with Sulaiman and Dawood alayhi salam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that they had this ability to speak to the animals and control the birds. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here, وَحُشِرَ لِسُلَيْمَانَ جُنُودُهُ مِنَ الْجِنِّ وَالْإِنسِ وَالطَّيْرِ فَهُمْ يُوزَعُونَ. SubhanAllah. That Sulaiman, he had an army, and he would gather the army. And this army would be of jinn, of ins, of humans, and of birds. And we know the famous story of Bilqis, where he gathered his army and the birds, and then he looked and he said, where's the hudhud? I don't see the hudhud. And the hudhud came later and said, I'm late because I found a queen that is worshipping in the wrong way. We have to do the da'wah. So we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout the Quran talks about the bird as a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we see also that this is a sign to the people of Mecca. The people of Mecca, as we know, they were mushrikeen, they were polytheists. They didn't worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But they knew of the story in their history where the Kaaba was about to be destroyed. Abraham was coming, and he had this army of elephants, and they were marching on Mecca to destroy the shrine. So there will be no competition with him, that everyone will come to his shrine in what we know now as Yemen. But what did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do? وَأَرْسَلَ عَلَيْهِمْ طَيْرًا أَبَابِيلَ. SubhanAllah, a surah that most of us, or all of us know. Surah Al-Fil. What is Surah Al-Fil all about? It's about these elephants marching to destroy the Kaaba. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how did he destroy them? He could have done an earthquake, he could have a flood, he could have done a rainstorm, but he sent birds. And these birds came and they threw these pebbles and they destroyed the army of Abraham. And the Meccans, even though they were not Muslim and they were polytheists, they remember that story. That was part of their history. That they were aware that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected the Kaaba through birds. So brothers and sisters in Islam, what do we understand from these different examples? First, brothers and sisters in Islam, we see that when people came to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they challenged him. They said, if you're a prophet, where's your sign? Where's your miracle? Musa, he had a staff. Isa, he could walk on water. What do you have? So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had miracles, and we know this from the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The many miracles, whether that of feeding people, in the Battle of Badr, the angels came. But one of the things Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds, it says, there are signs around you all the time, but you do not realize them. You have the sun, the moon, the stars, the night, the day. These are miraculous things. These are things that if we really paid attention to, subhanAllah, we would be true believers. That when we come here to pray Fajr, it's dark, and then when we exit, we see the light. That is a miracle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That we are here on this earth, and we're rotating in this vast galaxy, and that there are suns, and there are planets, and there are moons. This is part of our iman. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, speaking here, this is an ayat لِقَوْمِ يُؤْمِنُونَ, for people who truly believe. And in a similar way, the animals that we see around us, and the birds who are floating in the sky, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed this to occur. Just like the ship, if you throw a pebble into the ocean, it would sink. But then you have a ship who's built in a particular way that weighs tons, that is carrying tens of thousands of crates, is floating in the ocean. And if you threw a pebble into the sky, it would fall back on the earth. But now we have planes carrying thousands, hundreds of people, even sometimes thousands, and it's floating in the sky. This is a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in particularly with the birds, even the scientists say they are a creation. They even go back all the way to the dinosaurs. This is one of the first creations. And then when we see them on this earth today, they remind us of this glorious history. And we see, brothers and sisters in Islam, that part of our deen, and especially in the month of Ramadan, is that when we see a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we don't just say, oh, that was a beautiful sunset, or that was a beautiful, look at that birds. Rather, we say, this should connect us back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This should connect us back to having iman and faith. And then this should connect us back to Ar-Rahman, the most merciful. Because if he wanted, he could have every ship sink. He could have every plane crash. But because of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he makes those things float. He makes those things glide. And this is an example for us that inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Subhanallah. Every journey, whether it's on a ship, whether it's on a plane, or whether it's on foot, every journey will return back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. Wal asr inna al-insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.